Ever get curious about how much easy access to online porn kind of shapes things for us, like in our lives?
Yeah, I think a lot of people do these days.
Totally. And you sent over some super interesting research on this whole thing.
Oh, yeah, it's fascinating, Gary.
So let's really dive deep into it, what people often call porn addiction.
Okay, sounds good.
Our goal is to, cut through all the noise and figure out what's actually going on.
Exactly. I mean, like the term porn addiction, that's what we hear a lot, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But scientifically, we tend to use terms like problematic pornography use or PPU
Okay.
and compulsive sexual behavior disorder, which is CSBD.
Gotcha.
And it's kind of interesting because like the DSM-5-TR, it doesn't officially recognize porn addiction as a thing.
Huh.
But the ICD-11 does recognize CSBD.
Interesting. So different systems, different labels?
Right, exactly. But no matter what we call it, like if someone's engagement is causing problems, it has real effects.
Absolutely. So let's break it down. Like, what do these terms actually mean for you and me?
Sure.
What does it look like when using porn becomes a problem?
Okay, so someone who's experiencing what they would call porn addiction, they might feel like they just can't stop even though they really want to. It kind of takes over their life, becomes a huge focus, interferes with their day-to-day, and they still feel this need to engage with it even when it's having all these negative consequences like on their health or their responsibilities.
Okay, so that inability to stop despite wanting to,
But
that really aligns with the whole idea of addiction, right?
yeah, definitely.
And so then what about PCU? How is that different?
So PPU stands for problematic internet pornography viewing.
Okay.
And it's basically when, viewing porn is causing problems for you either personally or in your relationships.
Got it.
And this often involves spending a ton of time on it, like instead of interacting with people in the real world.
Yeah, makes sense. And then how does CSBD fit into all of this?
So CSBD, compulsive sexual behavior disorder, as it's defined in the ICD-11, it's more about this persistent lack of control over intense, repetitive sexual urges.
Okay.
And it becomes the central thing in their life,
I know.
They've tried to cut back, but they haven't been successful.
Right.
And they keep going, even though there are all these negative consequences.
Okay, so it sounds like PPU could be considered a type of CSBD then?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to look at it.
This persistent, uncontrollable urge that really messes with our ability to function and have healthy relationships.
Exactly. And it can lead to a lot of distress guilt, even things like, pornography-induced erectile dysfunction.
Wow. So regardless of what we call it, there's a clear pattern of behavior here with some pretty serious potential consequences.
Definitely.
So what's actually happening in the brain that kind of drives this behavior?
Okay, so when you view pornography, it triggers a big release of dopamine in your brain's reward system.
Okay.
And dopamine is basically like a pleasure chemical.
Yeah.
It makes us feel good.
Right.
So it reinforces that behavior. You're more likely to do it again.
Makes sense. But the thing is, with repeated exposure, your brain can actually start to become less sensitive to dopamine.
Oh, so you need more to get the same effect.
Exactly. It's like needing more and more sugar to satisfy that sweet tooth.
So basically you build up a tolerance just like with drugs or alcohol.
Yeah, it's very similar.
And it's not just dopamine, right? There are other things going on in the brain too.
Oh, absolutely. There are a bunch of other neurochemicals involved like epinephrine and norepinephrine.
Okay.
And imbalances in things like serotonin can also play a role.
Gotcha. So it's a complex system.
It really is. What's fascinating is that repeated exposure can actually rewire the brain, leading to desensitization.
Really? Wow.
So the thing with online pornography is it's often so highly stimulating, we call it a supernormal stimulus.
A supernormal stimulus.
Okay, and this can actually make your brain less responsive to the more subtle rewards we experience in real life.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
These online images are often so hyper real, it's a lot to take in.
Right, and specific parts of the brain are affected too.
Like which ones?
Well, for example, the amygdala, which is your brain's alarm system,
Yeah.
it can become super reactive to cues associated with pornography.
So just seeing a certain website or hearing a certain sound could trigger a craving.
Exactly. And meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, which helps us with decision-making and impulse control, that can actually be negatively impacted.
Oh, wow. So it's harder to resist those urges.
Right. And we even see changes in areas of the brain related to reward processing and executive function.
So the brain is definitely a major player here. But it's not just a biological issue, right? There are psychological and societal factors at play too.
Absolutely. I mean, often pornography can become a way of coping with other underlying issues like stress, anxiety, depression.
Makes sense.
Especially for people who have experienced trauma, it can be a form of escape or numbing those difficult feelings.
Right.
And feelings of loneliness and low self-esteem can also lead people to seek out that virtual connection.
It's like a readily available coping mechanism.
Exactly. And then certain personality traits like impulsivity can also increase vulnerability.
Okay.
And then on top of that, you've got all these societal factors, the normalization of pornography, the ease of access online, the anonymity. It all contributes to increased consumption.
Right. It's everywhere.
And even your personal beliefs can play a role, for someone with strong moral or religious beliefs that clash with their pornography use. They might experience a lot of guilt and perceive themselves as being addicted, even if their actual usage isn't that different from someone without those beliefs.
So it's this really complex interplay of factors.
Definitely.
And the consequences can be pretty significant, right, across different areas of life.
Oh, absolutely. We see impacts on mental health,
Yep.
increased anxiety, depression, guilt, social isolation.
Yeah.
Relationships often suffer too, decreased intimacy, trust issues, unrealistic expectations.
Makes sense.
Daily functioning can be impaired. People start neglecting responsibilities. They're less productive.
Right.
And there can even be physical consequences like erectile dysfunction and other sexual dysfunctions.
So if someone's listening to this and they're recognizing this pattern in their own life, what can they do? Are there pathways to recovery?
Definitely. I mean, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is a really key approach.
Okay. How does that work?
It helps people change those negative thought patterns and develop healthier ways of coping with their emotions.
Okay.
Acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, is another great option.
And what does that focus on?
That one emphasizes accepting those urges without necessarily acting on them and aligning your actions with your values.
Gotcha. And what about support groups?
Support groups are huge. Places like SAA, Sex Addicts Anonymous, and PPU Partners Anonymous. They offer a sense of community and accountability, which can be so helpful.
It's good to know that there are these therapeutic options available.
Definitely.
Are there also things people can do on their own, practical steps they can take?
For sure, setting boundaries around internet use is a big one. Like maybe limiting your access or using content filters.
Right.
Developing healthy hobbies and social connections is super important too.
Makes sense. Get out there, connect with people.
Exactly, and build a strong support system, people you can talk to and be accountable to. And then technology can actually be a really useful tool here too.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Things like website blockers and accountability software, they can actually help you stay on track.
So it's about using tech in a positive way.
Exactly.
That's cool. And what about sustaining those changes long term?
Yeah.
How do people stay on track?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think the key is to really identify your triggers.
Triggers meaning?
Like, what are the specific situations or emotions that usually lead to those urges? Is it stress? Is it boredom? Is it loneliness?
Right, noticing those patterns.
Exactly. And once you know what your triggers are, you can start to develop a personalized relapse prevention plan.
Okay.
And having ongoing support is super important too, from a therapist, a support group, friends, family.
So it's not about doing it alone.
Not at all. And I think it's important to remember that setbacks can happen.
Like you might slip up.
Yeah, and that's totally normal. It's not about being perfect. It's about learning from those experiences and getting back on track with your recovery plan.
So be kind to yourself.
Exactly. Self-compassion is huge.
That makes a lot of sense. And finally, are there certain people who might be more vulnerable to developing problematic pornography use?
That's a good question. Research suggests that younger adults tend to report higher rates of problematic use.
Okay, so age might be a factor.
It seems like it. And people with pre-existing mental health conditions like anxiety or depression, they're also at higher risk.
Makes sense.
As are people with substance use disorders,
So there could be some overlap there.
Definitely.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening conversation.
Yeah.
It's clear that while the language we use around porn addiction is still evolving, the potential for real harm is definitely there.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary.
But the good news is that recovery is possible.
Absolutely. Recognizing the impact and understanding the support that's out there, those are really important first steps towards healthier behaviors.
Well said. So for everyone listening, as you think about everything we've talked about today, what's one small step you could take towards greater self-awareness or setting some healthy boundaries for yourself?
That's a great question for listeners to consider.
Food for thought. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.